You are a parent in a hunter-gatherer band, somewhere in prehistoric Europe, roughly 34,000 years ago. Your group moves constantly, following animal migrations across frozen landscapes. Every person in your group has a role. Every person has to contribute. Food is scarce, winters are brutal, and survival is never guaranteed. And your child cannot walk. For most of recorded history, scholars assumed they knew exactly what happened next. The child would be left behind. The group couldn't afford to carry someone who couldn't keep up. This was the ancient world, brutal, practical, unsentimental. Nature didn't care about feelings, and neither did the people fighting to survive inside it. There's just one problem with that assumption. The bones tell a different story. In 1957, archaeologists began excavating a site called Sunghir, roughly 190 kilometers east of Moscow. What they found over the following decades challenged almost everything the academic world had assumed about prehistoric attitudes towards the vulnerable. Two boys, approximately 10 and 12 years old, were found buried head to head in a long, narrow grave. The burial was extraordinary, not just for its age, which is around 34,000 years, but for what surrounded them. More than 10,000 mammoth ivory beads, 20 armbands, 300 pierced fox teeth, 16 carved mammoth ivory spears, deer antlers, artwork. A 40-year-old man buried nearby, presumably a fully functioning adult contributor to the group, had a fraction of those objects accompanying him into death. But here is the detail that stopped researchers cold. Analysis of the boys' remains showed signs of physical conditions that would have significantly limited their ability to contribute to group survival. These were not the strongest members of the tribe. They were, by the brutal logic most historians assumed governed prehistoric life, a liability. And yet they were buried like kings. Bioarchaeologist Lorna Tilley has spent her career building what she calls the bioarchaeology of care, a framework for reading ancient bones not just as evidence of disease or injury, but as evidence of how a community responded to it. One of her most striking case studies involves a man now known only as Burial 9, excavated at a prehistoric site in Vietnam. He lived approximately 4,000 years ago and had suffered severe paralysis from the waist down since adolescence, the result of a condition that left his lower spine fused and his legs wasted to almost nothing. He could not walk, he could not fish, he could not hunt. In a small, resource-stressed community where signs of malnutrition appear in the bones of nearly everyone buried nearby, this man was kept alive for years. Someone fed him, someone moved him, someone adjusted the group's survival calculations to include a person who, by every conventional measure, should not have survived. As Tilly noted in her research, this tells us something fundamental. In a small society that was severely stressed, someone who couldn't contribute was still supported, accommodated, and adjusted to. That tells us, she argued, that people mattered, they were valued. The assumption that prehistoric humans discarded the weak is not just inaccurate. Researchers now believe it was shaped more by what we projected onto the past than by what the evidence actually shows. In 2024, an international team of researchers published findings in Nature Communications after screening DNA from roughly 10,000 ancient and pre-modern human remains. They identified 8 cases of children born with chromosomal conditions, including Down syndrome and Edwards syndrome, in populations spread across Spain, Bulgaria, Finland, Greece, and Ireland, dating back as far as 4,500 years. Every single one of those children had been buried with care. Several had been buried with special objects. One, a 6-month-old boy with Down syndrome, found in a portal tomb in northwestern Ireland, dating to around 3,500 BC, had been given a burial that stood out even among the other graves at the site. Archaeologist Roberto Risch, one of the study's co-authors, described being puzzled by the pattern. These children were given either standard or, in some cases, very special burials. They were treated no differently from others, or were given even more care in death. His conclusion was direct. These children were loved and cherished, just like any child today. None of this means the ancient world was uniformly compassionate. The historical record is complicated. Ancient Greek and Roman scholars are often cited as showing intolerance for disability in the newborn, with some physicians indicating that midwives were responsible for deciding whether a child was worth raising. Most Stone Age human societies routinely practiced infanticide, and estimates of children killed in the Mesolithic and Neolithic eras vary from 15 to 50%. Poverty, famine, and resource scarcity drove decisions that are deeply uncomfortable to examine. But the archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that the story is not as simple as the survival of the fittest narrative that dominated earlier scholarship. Infanticide and abandonment were not the default attitude toward disability and impairment in the ancient world. At least one ancient Greek physician valued individuals with congenital impairments like clubfoot and limb difference enough to dedicate professional thought and practice to their care. What the bones show, again and again across thousands of years and dozens of sites, is that ancient humans were capable of something that doesn't fit neatly into the brutal efficiency model. They were capable of choosing, at real cost to themselves, to keep someone alive who would never hunt, never gather, never defend the camp. The question of why is harder to answer than the question of whether. But researchers point to something that appears to be genuinely ancient in human behavior, a care instinct that predates agriculture, predates cities, predates written language. Evidence for care runs in a continuing timeline from Neanderthal times right through to later periods, suggesting this wasn't a later civilizational development, but something embedded far deeper in what it means to be human. The child who couldn't walk 34,000 years ago was buried with more ivory beads than most adults in their community ever touched. We don't know their name. We don't know what role they played in the group's daily life beyond what their bones tell us they couldn't do. But someone knew them. Someone valued them enough to spend extraordinary resources marking their death. And in that single fact, buried under Russian permafrost for 34 millennia, is a reminder that the line between ancient and modern runs through the middle of something we still recognize. People mattered then, not always, not everywhere, but more than we assumed. And that turns out to be one of the most human things we have ever discovered about ourselves.